I pulled the RV off the narrow, dusty road and into the shadow of Dead Man's Gulch. The engine sputtered to a stop, and for a moment I sat there in the silence, staring out at the barren valley that stretched before me. The Ruby Mountains loomed in the distance, jagged and dark against the fading light. This was what I wanted: isolation, quiet, and a place where the world couldn't find me. The RV had become my escape after Laura died. I could roam wherever I wanted, park wherever I pleased, and it felt like a kind of freedom. But now, sitting here in the middle of nowhere, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The place had a weight to it, like the air was thick with something unseen, something waiting. I climbed out of the RV and stretched, the dry desert air biting at my skin as the temperature dropped with the setting sun. Dead Man's Gulch was as desolate as it sounded. I'd read about it in a ghost stories book I found at a thrift store. Some legend about miners who'd disappeared back in the late 1800s. They'd supposedly seen shadowy figures in the valley at night before the earth collapsed and swallowed them whole. I didn't believe in ghosts or cryptids or whatever nonsense the locals spouted about the place. I just wanted to be alone, away from the pitying glances, the endless condolences. No one understood how grief gnawed at you, hollowing you out until nothing was left. Setting up camp took all of 15 minutes. I parked the RV next to the remnants of an old mining camp, a few rusted-out carts, the skeletal remains of a cabin, and a collapsed mine shaft that disappeared into the hillside. It was perfect. No people, no distractions, just me, the desert, and the stars. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time I finished dinner. Canned chili, nothing fancy. I sat at the small table inside the RV, staring at the book in front of me. It was filled with old tales of ghost sightings and strange disappearances, most of them from around here. The locals called it the Phantom of the Mines, some kind of shadowy creature that haunted the valleys, stalking anyone who got too close to the abandoned shafts. I flipped through the pages, skimming over the accounts of miners who'd sworn they'd seen something dark moving in the fog just before disaster struck. I shook my head and closed the book. Ghosts, shadows, it was all bullshit. Laura would have laughed at the idea. She'd never been scared of anything. Not of the woods, not of the wild. She was fearless, but I wasn't Laura. As I cleaned up, the RV's lights flickered. I paused, glancing up at the ceiling. The lights steadied again, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just a glitch, I told myself. The RV was old. Things broke. But the air felt colder all of a sudden, and when I glanced out the window, I swore I saw movement. Something shifting in the darkness, just beyond the range of the headlights. I stepped outside, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound. The night was still. Too still. The kind of quiet that presses down on you. I scanned the area, the beam from my flashlight cutting through the shadows. Nothing moved. Just rocks, dirt, and the skeletal remains of the old mining camp. But then I heard it. Faint, like the sound of gravel shifting underfoot. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I swung the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there. "Get a grip, Jake," I muttered under my breath. "It's just the wind." I turned back toward the RV, ready to call it a night, when I saw them. Handprints, long streaks of dust trailing down the windows as if someone, or something, had dragged their fingers across the glass. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. I was alone. I knew that. No one had passed me on the road for hours. No one was out here. At least, no one should have been. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The RV felt smaller, the walls pressing in as the wind outside picked up, howling through the narrow canyon. I sat at the table, staring at the window, waiting for something to happen. But the night dragged on, and nothing did. The next morning, I woke to find the RV completely dead. No power, no lights, no water pump, nothing. I popped the hood and checked the battery, completely drained. It didn't make sense. I'd had it checked before I left. It was supposed to last for weeks. Frustrated, I grabbed my tools and spent most of the day trying to figure out what was wrong, but everything seemed fine. The battery just died. By late afternoon, I gave up. I was stuck out here for the night, at least until I could figure out a way to charge the battery. I cursed under my breath, wiping sweat from my forehead. This wasn't what I'd signed up for, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the dead battery wasn't just bad luck. I decided to go for a walk, clear my head. Maybe I could find a higher point, get some cell service, or at least get a better look at the area. The old mine shaft loomed in the distance, and I made my way toward it. The ground was hard and cracked, littered with strange, deep marks that crisscrossed the dirt. They looked like they'd been dragged by something large. Too large. I reached the entrance of the mine, staring into the gaping darkness. The air was cooler here, thick with the smell of dust and rot. The opening had collapsed years ago, the rocks jagged and sharp. But there, in the dirt, were more of those strange marks, long, deep gouges in the ground, like something had been clawing its way out. I backed away, my chest tightening. It was just a mine, just some old rocks and dirt. There was no reason to be freaked out. But as I turned to leave, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moving at the edge of the rocks. I whipped around, but it was gone. I ran back to the RV, my heart pounding in my chest. The sun was setting again, casting long, dark shadows across the valley. I slammed the door shut and locked it, feeling like a child hiding from monsters under the bed. But that night, the monster wasn't under the bed. It was outside. The first knock came just after midnight. A loud, deliberate bang on the side of the RV, like someone was pounding their fist against the metal. I shot up, grabbing the shotgun I kept next to the bed. My hand shook as I fumbled with the shells, loading it as fast as I could. Another bang. Closer this time, I stepped toward the door, my breath catching in my throat. "Who's there?" I shouted, but my voice cracked, betraying the fear I was trying to hide. No answer, just the sound of gravel shifting outside. The wind had died down completely, leaving only an eerie silence. I grabbed the flashlight and threw open the door, stepping out into the night. The cold hit me like a slap, and the beam of the flashlight sliced through the darkness, illuminating nothing, no one. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the area. That's when I saw it. A dark, shifting figure at the edge of the rocks, its form flickering like smoke in the wind. My mouth went dry, and for a second I couldn't move. The thing didn't have a face, not one I could see, but I felt its eyes on me, burning through the darkness. It didn't run. It didn't charge. It just watched. I raised the shotgun, my finger trembling on the trigger, and fired. The blast echoed through the valley, but the thing didn't move. Instead, it faded, its form dissolving into the night like it had never been there at all. I stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock the door. The lights flickered again, and then everything went dark. The RV's power completely failed, plunging me into total blackness. I sat there in the dark, the shotgun in my lap, waiting, listening, but the thing didn't come back. By morning, I'd had enough. I packed up what I could and decided to leave. Battery or no battery, I wasn't staying here another night. I stepped outside, squinting against the bright sun. The handprints were gone, the strange marks in the dirt erased as if the wind had swept them away. I climbed into the driver's seat, ready to give it one last shot. And just like that, the RV started. No sputtering, no struggle. It purred to life like nothing had ever been wrong. I didn't wait to question it. I hit the gas and sped down the canyon road, the rocky landscape blurring past me. The weight in the air lifted as I left Dead Man's Gulch behind. The fog that had clung to the valley was gone, replaced by clear, open skies, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something. Something dark. Something that still lingered in those minds, waiting for the next person foolish enough to camp there. As I pulled onto the highway, the RV's engine hummed smoothly, but I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadow still following me. But all I saw was the endless road ahead. The Beast of Blackwater Ridge. I've always prided myself on being the guy who keeps his cool, no matter what. That's why I was leading this trip, deep into the Blackwater Ridge. Monongahela National Forest was supposed to be a challenge, and I was ready for it. I'd hiked dozens of trails tougher than this, and I wanted to prove that to my old friends, especially Nate, who couldn't even set up a tent without breaking a sweat. But there's something about being miles away from civilization, surrounded by nothing but endless trees, that starts to mess with your head. As soon as we arrived, I could feel it. Not that I'd let anyone see that, of course. "Kara, you got the map?" I called out as we packed up the last of the gear. "Yep, but I doubt we'll need it with you in charge," she winked, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. I grinned. She knew how to stroke my ego. It was one of the things I loved about her. Nate, on the other hand, was struggling to adjust the straps of his pack. His face was already red, and we hadn't even started walking yet. "Can we take it slow, guys? I haven't done this in a while." "Sure, Nate. We'll pace ourselves," I said, trying to hide my impatience. Sarah, ever the practical one, rolled her eyes but said nothing. She was the scientist of the group, the one who'd be lecturing us about rare plants and ecosystems by the time we were halfway up the trail. She was here more for research than the hike, but I knew she could handle herself. We hit the trailhead late in the morning, the sun already filtering through the thick canopy above. The first couple of miles were easy enough, well marked, a few uphill climbs, nothing too rough. Nate fell behind pretty quickly, as expected, but we made enough stops to let him catch up. By the time we reached our first campsite, the air had a heavy, oppressive feel. The sun dipped below the trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. The dense foliage seemed to swallow up the light, leaving us in a strange twilight. We set up camp without much trouble, although Nate complained about the weight of his gear the whole time. Our tents were cheap, sure, but they'd do the job. Sarah was meticulous, making sure her tent was perfectly aligned with the slope of the ground. "It's going to rain tomorrow," she said, almost as an afterthought. "Clear skies right now," I pointed out, but she just shrugged. Night came quickly, faster than I expected. By the time we had the fire going, the forest had gone almost completely silent. No birds, no insects, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of leaves. It was weird. I'd been in plenty of forests, but something about this one felt off. "You guys hear that?" Nate said, glancing around nervously. "Hear what?" Kara asked, stirring the pot of stew she'd made. "The fire?" "No, it's like, I don't know, like something moving out there." I paused, listening. At first there was nothing, but then I heard it too, soft, distant, and low. A growl, almost like the sound of a heavy breath. "Coyotes," I said, trying to sound confident. "Nothing to worry about. They're probably more scared of us than we are of them." But I saw Sarah tense up. She was studying the woods beyond the firelight, her face set in concentration. I didn't like that. When I turned back to Nate, he was pale, fidgeting with his hands. "Maybe we should keep the fire going all night," he said. "Relax, Nate. We're fine. Nothing's coming near us." But the truth was, something felt off. Even I couldn't shake it. The second day was rough. The terrain started to get steeper, and the trail was less defined. Nate was falling behind more often, and Kara's enthusiasm was starting to wane. We pressed on, but there was a growing sense of unease that none of us could shake. Halfway through the day, we found something that made me stop in my tracks. A deer carcass, ripped apart and strewn across the trail. Blood, dark and congealed, soaked into the ground around it. Whatever had killed it wasn't hunting for food. It looked like something had torn it apart just for the hell of it. Nate gagged, turning away from the sight. What the hell? Kara knelt beside the body, her face a mix of curiosity and horror. This wasn't a bear. Look at the size of these tracks. I crouched down next to her. She was right. The prints were huge, human-like, but twisted, like something was wrong with the feet. There were long, deep claw marks gouged into the dirt. I glanced at Sarah. Her face was pale, her brow furrowed in deep concern. "This isn't normal," she whispered. "We should go back." TJ, the confident TJ who could handle anything, suddenly felt a sliver of doubt crawl up his spine. "Nah, we're fine," I said, brushing it off. "It's just some animal. We'll be careful. Let's keep moving." But I knew, we all knew, something was out there, watching. That night was worse. We set up camp earlier, just as the sky began to darken. The wind picked up, carrying a strange metallic scent. Something foul. The air felt heavy, thick with an unexplainable dread. The fire crackled low, throwing flickering shadows on the tents, but none of us felt the comfort of its warmth. We sat closer than usual, even Nate, who had barely spoken since we found the deer. I sat there, gripping the handle of my knife, trying to tell myself I was just being paranoid. But when I looked at the faces of my friends, I knew I wasn't the only one feeling it. "Do you hear that?" Sarah said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. We all went silent, listening. At first, there was nothing but the wind in the trees, and then I heard it. A low, guttural growl. Closer this time, closer than it should have been. "What the hell is that?" Nate's voice cracked, his eyes wide with fear. "It's just an animal," I said again, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince anymore. But it wasn't. We all knew that. This was something different, something wrong. The growling grew louder, and then, from the shadows beyond the firelight, something moved. It was fast, so fast that I barely caught a glimpse of it. But I saw enough. A tall, hunched figure, just beyond the ring of light, watching us. Its eyes glowed, bright and unnatural, fixed on us with a predatory intensity that made my blood run cold. Kara stood up. "I'm going to check it out," she said, grabbing her flashlight. "No," Sarah hissed, grabbing her arm. "Stay here. Don't be stupid." But Kara, always the fearless one, shook her off and stepped into the darkness. "Kara." I stood up, grabbing my flashlight. "Wait!" The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating trees and underbrush, but there was no sign of the creature. I turned toward Kara, but she had gone too far ahead, and then the light hit it. The thing, tall, gaunt, with dark, leathery skin stretched tight over a distorted, humanoid frame, was standing just behind her. Its eyes glowed red, almost burning. For a second, I thought I was seeing things. Then Kara turned around and screamed. The creature lunged. "Kara!" I shouted, running toward her. But it was too late. The thing moved impossibly fast, grabbing her and dragging her into the darkness. Her scream cut short, replaced by the sound of something wet and tearing. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, unable to process what I'd just seen. Sarah and Nate were screaming behind me, telling me to run, but I couldn't move until I saw the creature again. It was staring right at me, its glowing eyes burning through the darkness, and that was enough to break the spell. "Run!" I yelled, finally snapping out of it. We bolted through the forest, stumbling over roots and rocks, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature's growls followed us, closing in, always just out of sight but far too close. We ran for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. I don't know how we made it back to the trailhead, but when we did, I collapsed, my legs shaking uncontrollably. Nate was sobbing, bent over, hands on his knees. Sarah was pale, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. None of us spoke for a long time. Finally, Nate broke the silence. She's gone. Kara's dead." I didn't have anything to say. I couldn't. I had led us here, and Kara was dead because of it. Sarah was the first to speak. "We need to go, now, before it finds us again." But I couldn't move, not yet, not after everything. By the time we reached the edge of the forest, it was dawn. The creature hadn't followed us, or if it had, it stayed hidden. We left TJ behind, bleeding and broken on the forest floor. The road into the Adirondacks was long, winding, and empty, just how I liked it. After a few hours of driving, I pulled the RV off the narrow trail and into a small clearing by the lake. The pines stretched high and thick around me, their dark green needles blending into the overcast sky. This was exactly what I needed. Complete isolation, no people, no noise, just the quiet of the forest and the sound of my own thoughts. I parked the RV, turned off the engine, and stepped outside. The air was cool, crisp, with the faint smell of pine and damp earth. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant ripple of water. Perfect. This place would give me the quiet I craved, a chance to think without the distractions of civilian life. Ever since leaving the military, I'd been chasing peace, and this felt like it could be the spot where I'd finally find it. I grabbed my gear and went about setting up camp. It didn't take long. I'd done this enough times to know the routine. Gather firewood, get a small fire going, and make sure the RV was ready for a night out in the wilderness. As I made my way through the trees, something caught my eye. On one of the nearby trunks, there was a strange marking, a crude carving of a figure, long and thin, etched into the bark. I frowned, running my fingers over it. Just a kid's prank, I figured. Probably a bored hiker from weeks ago, but as I moved through the forest, gathering wood, I found more of them, carved figures on the trees, all tall and slender, stretching higher than any human could reach. It was strange, but I wasn't here to think about strange things. I was here to forget. By the time the sun set, the fire was crackling softly, casting flickering light across the clearing. I settled in next to the warmth, staring out at the darkening forest. There was a peace in the solitude, something comforting about being alone with the sounds of the wilderness. But as the night wore on, I started to notice something. The forest was too quiet. No rustling leaves, no night animals scurrying about. Just silence. And then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, I heard it. A soft rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I sat up, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. Nothing. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. I shook my head. "You're just on edge," I muttered to myself, trying to dismiss the tension building in my chest. The wilderness could play tricks on you if you let it. I knew that better than most. I was here to clear my head, not to let it run wild. But then, I saw it. At the edge of my vision, just for a split second, something moved. Tall, thin, just beyond the trees. I jumped to my feet, gripping the flashlight tighter, and aimed the beam toward where I'd seen the figure. But there was nothing. Only the dark outline of the pines swaying slightly in the wind. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, every muscle tense, waiting for something to step out of the shadows. But, after a long moment, the rustling stopped. The trees swayed, and the forest fell back into its unsettling quiet. I forced myself to sit back down, staring into the fire, trying to shake off the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The next morning, I woke early, determined to shake off the nerves from the night before. I grabbed my gear and decided to hike deeper into the woods. Maybe, if I put some distance between myself and the campsite, I could clear my head. The trail was faint, barely more than a thin path winding through the trees. As I walked, I found more of the carvings on the trees, each one stranger than the last. They were everywhere, slender, elongated figures with no faces, all staring outward, all watching. The forest felt darker here, the canopy thick enough that the sunlight barely broke through. About an hour in, I reached a ridge overlooking the valley. The view was stunning. Endless trees stretching out below, the mountains rising in the distance. I was about to pull out my camera when I heard footsteps behind me. "Mornin'," a voice said. I turned to see an older man, probably in his 60s, standing a few feet away. He was holding a bundle of firewood in his arms, his face weathered and sun-creased, like someone who'd spent his entire life outdoors. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," I said, giving him a nod. "Not many people come this deep into the forest," the man replied, his voice low and rough. He looked me up and down, then glanced toward the valley. "You camping nearby?" "Yeah, just over by the lake. Trying to get some quiet." He gave me a long look, his expression unreadable. "You should be careful. This part of the Adirondacks, it's different." I raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" He glanced around, his eyes flicking nervously toward the trees. "There's something in these woods. People call it the Watcher. It stays deep in the forest, watching from the shadows. You see it once, and you'll start seeing it everywhere." I laughed, shaking my head. "Local ghost stories?" The man didn't smile. "It's not a story. It's real. People who see the Watcher, they don't come back the same." He took a step closer. "I'm telling you this because you look like you've seen things. You know when something's not right. And something's not right here." I met his gaze, feeling that familiar knot of unease tightening in my gut. "What do you mean?" "You'll know when it's close. You'll hear it first, and then you'll feel it." He turned, starting back down the trail. "Just don't stay too long." I watched him go, his words echoing in my mind. Part of me wanted to laugh it off as superstition, but the way he'd looked at me, like he'd seen the same thing I had last night, made it hard to dismiss. That evening, back at camp, the unease was worse. The forest felt like it was closing in, the trees towering higher than I remembered, the shadows deeper, darker. The wind had picked up, making the fire flicker and sputter, but it didn't drown out the sounds. The rustling came back, louder this time, and with it, something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the campsite. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the darkness, but the beam barely seemed to penetrate the trees. The footsteps stopped as soon as the light hit them, but when I moved the beam, they started again. I stood, turning in a slow circle, the flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. My pulse was pounding, adrenaline kicking in. Every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone out here. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anything. And then, just beyond the firelight, I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing between the trees. Its body was almost skeletal, its limbs too long, its head bent slightly as if it were watching me from above. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were hollow, dark pits that stared right at me. My blood ran cold. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking despite myself. The figure didn't respond. It stayed still, silent, its form almost blending into the shadows. I raised my knife, backing toward the RV. The figure remained at the edge of the light, watching, waiting. I reached the door, yanked it open, and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. For hours, I sat by the window, knife in hand, waiting for the figure to move. But it never did. It just stood there, barely visible in the darkness, its hollow eyes fixed on the RV. At dawn, the figure was gone, but the carvings had multiplied, dozens of them surrounding the campsite, the same tall, thin figures etched into the trees like a silent army. I didn't waste time. I packed up everything, threw it into the RV, and started the engine. As I drove away, the carvings seemed to watch me, following me down the narrow trail, their hollow eyes staring. I didn't stop until I was miles away from the Adirondacks, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror. But even as the trees thinned and the road stretched out in front of me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the watcher was still out there. Somewhere in those woods, it was still watching, and maybe it always would be. I had been driving for hours, the Mojave Desert stretching endlessly around me, barren and vast under the relentless sun. The road was long behind me now, just an empty trail of dust leading out to nowhere. Perfect. This was exactly what I needed. A break from work, from the grind, from people. Out here, there was nothing but silence and space. No cell towers, no deadlines, no distractions. Just me and the desert. I pulled the RV to a stop near a rocky outcrop and stepped out. The air was dry and still, the kind of quiet that felt like it was pressing down on you. I took a deep breath, inhaling the warm scent of sand and stone. This was my escape. No buzzing phone, no frantic emails, just the open sky and the endless horizon. I set up camp quickly, parking the RV in the shade of the rock formation and pulling out my gear. I wanted to explore before the light faded. There was something about the desert that always fascinated me. The way the landscape shifted from harsh to beautiful in a matter of hours. But right now, I was focused on one thing: silence. After weeks of being glued to my phone, running from meeting to meeting, the thought of being completely disconnected was a relief. No cell reception out here, no GPS signal, just me and the land. As I unpacked, I heard it. A faint sound, almost too soft to notice. A rhythmic beeping. At first I thought it was something inside the RV, maybe an alarm or a piece of equipment malfunctioning. But after a quick check of my gear, everything seemed fine. The sound persisted though, steady and faint, like a pulse just beneath the surface. I stepped outside, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but the desert was quiet. The only sound was the faint wind rustling through the rocks. I brushed it off, assuming it was some distant echo of the RV's systems, and finished setting up camp. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, I felt that familiar sense of calm wash over me. This was why I came here, to escape, to let my mind breathe. But that night, the beeping came back. I was sitting by the campfire, watching the flames flicker against the darkening sky, when the sound returned, clearer this time. It was still faint, but persistent. A soft, rhythmic pulse, like something distant calling out. I stood, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that was creeping up my spine. I wasn't the type to get spooked easily. Logic and reason were my tools, and they had served me well in the world of engineering. But there was something about the sound, something that felt wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped away from the fire into the darkness. The desert stretched out before me, vast and empty. I started walking, following the faint sound, the rhythmic pulse growing louder as I moved away from the RV. For a while, I saw nothing but sand and rock. The beeping seemed to fade, then grow louder again, like it was moving with me, always just out of reach. I kept walking, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night, but every time I thought I was getting closer, the sound slipped away. Finally, I stopped. My pulse was racing now, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The beeping had faded again, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the desert. The silence around me was heavy, almost suffocating. I turned back toward the RV, the fire still glowing faintly in the distance. As I walked, the beeping returned, faint but steady, like a distant heartbeat. The next morning, the sound was gone. The desert was still, quiet, as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Isolation could do that. The vast emptiness of the desert, the absence of any familiar sounds, it could mess with your head. I decided to hike further out, hoping to clear my mind. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, the sun already beating down on the sand. I grabbed my gear, making sure I had plenty of water, and started walking toward a rocky ridge I had spotted in the distance. Halfway there, I saw him. A man walking toward me from the opposite direction, his figure small against the endless desert. I hadn't expected to see anyone out here. This was a remote area, far off the beaten path. As the figure grew closer, I could make out an older man, his clothes worn and dusty, his face lined and weathered from the sun. "Hey," I called out, raising a hand as we approached each other. The man nodded, his eyes distant, almost vacant. "You camping out here alone?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, just me," I said, a little taken aback by his bluntness. "You?" "I've been walking for days," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You heard it yet?" "The signal?" I blinked, unsure if I had heard him right. "The signal?" He nodded, his expression grim. "You'll hear it. Once you hear it, you can't get it out of your head. I've been following it for days. It doesn't stop." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you talking about?" The man glanced around nervously, as if the desert itself was listening. "There's something out here, something that's been broadcasting for years. It gets inside your head, starts with the beeping. Then it gets louder. You'll see." I stared at him, unsure of what to say. He looked dehydrated, sunburned, like he'd been wandering the desert for days without rest. I offered him some water, but he shook his head and started walking again, heading back the way he came without another word. I stood there, watching him disappear into the distance, his words echoing in my mind. "Once you hear it, it doesn't stop." That night, the beeping was louder. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sound pulsed through the silence, steady and rhythmic, like it was coming from somewhere deep beneath the earth. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the sound was there, burrowing into my mind. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear, flashlight, GPS, water, and set out into the desert. I had to find the source. I had to know what was causing the sound. The desert was pitch black, the sky filled with stars. My flashlight cut through the darkness, the beam dancing across the rocks and sand as I followed the beeping. It was louder now, almost frantic, like it was pulling me towards something. The GPS was acting strange. flickering in and out, as if the signal was being disrupted. But I kept moving, my footsteps crunching in the sand, the beeping growing louder with every step. After what felt like hours, I saw it. A structure, half buried in the sand, a bunker or a weather station, long abandoned. The beeping was deafening now, emanating from somewhere inside. I hesitated, standing at the entrance of the bunker. The door was ajar, rusted and creaking in the wind. Everything in me screamed to turn back, to leave and forget about the sound. But I couldn't. The signal was pulling me in. I stepped inside. The air in the bunker was stale, suffocating. My flashlight flickered as I moved through the narrow corridor, the walls lined with rusted equipment and old, faded maps. The beeping was louder now, echoing through the metal walls, vibrating in my chest. At the end of the corridor, I found a small room. In the center, there was an old radio tower, its equipment still faintly powered by some unknown source. But that wasn't what caught my attention. On the walls were symbols, strange, intricate markings that looked like they had been carved into the metal. They spiraled outward, converging on the radio tower, as if they were feeding into it. In the corner of the room, I found a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The entries were short, scrawled in frantic handwriting. They talked about the signal, how it started with the beeping, how it got louder, how it never stopped. It gets inside your head. One entry read, "It's not just a sound, it's alive." As I read, the beeping shifted, turning into a high-pitched screech that pierced through my skull. I dropped the journal, clutching my head as the sound rattled through my brain. It wasn't just a signal. It was something more. Something that had been waiting, broadcasting, pulling people in. I had to get out. I stumbled out of the bunker, the sound still ringing in my ears, the desert spinning around me. I ran, my legs weak, my mind spinning. The landscape warped, the rocks and sand shifting as if the desert itself was alive, moving with the signal. When I finally made it back to the RV, I collapsed inside, my head pounding, the beeping now a constant dull hum in the back of my mind. I left the desert the next morning, driving as fast as I could, the beeping still faint but persistent. I didn't look back, even now. Days later, back in the city, I can still hear it. A faint, rhythmic pulse in the back of my mind, always there, always calling me back. The signal isn't done with me yet. The road into the boundary waters was a frozen ribbon through a sea of snow, the trees standing like silent sentinels under heavy blankets of ice. The RV's heater hummed steadily, but even that couldn't keep the biting cold out. I was deep into the wilderness now, the place I'd picked to spend a week. Just me, the frozen lake, and the stillness of winter. I'd been coming to places like this for years, ever since the accident. The solitude was the only thing that seemed to quiet my mind. This time, I was here to ice fish, maybe snap a few photos for my nature blog. But mostly, I was here to prove to myself that I could still handle it. The cold, the isolation, the memories. I pulled the RV to a stop by a small, frozen lake I'd scouted on a map. It was miles away from the nearest town, completely off the grid. Just how I liked it. I stepped out into the icy air, my breath fogging in front of me as I took in the sight. The lake was a vast white expanse, the ice thick enough to drive on, stretching out into the distance where the trees disappeared into a blur of white. Perfect. I set up camp quickly, parking the RV near the shoreline and gathering my gear for ice fishing. The cold had a way of creeping into your bones out here, but I didn't mind. I was used to it. I grabbed my auger, trudged out onto the ice, and started drilling a hole. The sound of the blade biting into the ice echoed through the stillness, sharp and harsh against the quiet of the wilderness. Then I heard it, a deep, low rumble that seemed to come from beneath the ice. I paused, the auger still in my hands, and listened. The sound came again, a low, distant vibration, like the ice shifting far beneath the surface. I'd heard ice groan before. Anyone who spends enough time in the cold knows the sound of a lake adjusting to the freeze. But this was different. It was deeper, longer, almost like something was moving down there. I brushed it off and kept drilling. By the time the hole was ready, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. I set up my fishing gear, lowered the line into the icy water, and settled in to wait. The cold crept in quickly, even through my heavy coat, but I was prepared for it. I'd done this 100 times before, and the routine was comforting. But that sound, the rumble beneath the ice, kept creeping back into my thoughts. As night fell, I lit a small fire near the shore, the flames flickering weakly against the chill. I sat by the fire, staring out at the frozen expanse of the lake. The stars were starting to appear in the clear sky above, bright and distant. And then I saw it, a light, faint, flickering and coming from beneath the ice. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe the moonlight hitting the ice in just the right way. But as I watched, the light moved, slow and steady, as if something was drifting beneath the surface. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but it was still there, faint and irregular, like a lantern swaying beneath the ice. I stood, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked toward the lake. The light seemed to pulse, growing brighter for a moment, then dimming again, always moving, always just out of reach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or a reflection of something from the sky. But deep down, I knew better. There was no one else out here, no one who could be moving under the ice. The rumble came again, louder this time, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. I took a step back, suddenly feeling exposed out there on the open ice. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I turned back toward the RV, my mind racing. The light, the sound, something wasn't right. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back out onto the lake, determined to make sense of it all. The sun was barely up and the cold was more biting than ever. As I walked, I glanced back toward the hole I'd drilled the day before. Something was off. There, by the edge of the hole, was a long, jagged crack running across the ice. The crack hadn't been there yesterday. It snaked out in a jagged line, as if something had pressed up from below. I knelt down, running my gloved fingers along the crack, feeling the cold seeping through the ice. The surface felt thin, too thin for the middle of winter, and then I noticed something glinting just beneath the ice. I leaned closer, peering into the crack. At first it looked like a piece of metal, rusted and sharp, lodged beneath the surface. I reached into the cold water, pulling it free. It was old, jagged, like part of a machine, but there was no reason for it to be here. The nearest road was miles away, and there hadn't been any mining or construction in the area for years. The metal was strange, sharp and smooth, like it had been cut clean. As I held the piece in my hand, the rumbling came again, louder now, closer. I stood quickly, scanning the lake. The light was back, faint but steady, moving beneath the ice closer than before. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold sweat break out under my coat. Something was down there. Something was moving. I backed away from the crack, my mind racing. The metal, the light, the sound. It all pointed to something beneath the ice, something unnatural. But what? The stories I'd heard over the years about strange things beneath the frozen lakes, about disappearances and creatures buried deep in the ice came flooding back. I'd always dismissed them as nonsense, campfire stories to scare the newcomers. But now, standing there in the middle of the frozen lake, I wasn't so sure. I needed answers. Later that day, as I was gathering more firewood, I came across an old ice fishing shack near the edge of the lake that looked abandoned, but there were fresh footprints in the snow leading up to the door. Curious, I approached, knocking lightly before pushing the door open. Inside, I found an older man, hunched over a small stove, warming his hands. His face was weathered, his beard streaked with gray, and he looked up at me with tired eyes as I stepped in. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man grunted, his eyes narrowing. "Not many come this deep into the wilderness." I hesitated. "I've been hearing strange sounds under the ice, and I saw a light last night moving beneath the surface. Do you know anything about that?" The man's expression darkened. He turned back to the stove, staring into the flames. "You shouldn't be out on that lake," he said quietly. "There are things beneath the ice, things that shouldn't be disturbed." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. The man sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "There's an old mining operation under that lake, abandoned long ago. They were digging deep, too deep. Some say they woke something up down there. Ever since, strange things have happened. People go missing. The ice breaks when it shouldn't. And that light, it's not the only thing that moves down there." A chill ran down my spine. "What's under there?" The man shook his head. "I don't know, but I've been coming out here for years, and I've seen enough to know when something isn't right. The lake's alive. It's watching you." That night, the light beneath the ice returned, brighter than before, pulsing like a heartbeat. I watched from the RV, my breath fogging up the window as the rumbling beneath the ice grew louder, more insistent. I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever was beneath the lake, it was waking up. I packed my gear quickly, throwing everything into the RV, but as I started the engine, the ground beneath the RV began to tremble. The rumbling was almost deafening now, vibrating up through the frozen earth. I glanced out toward the lake, and my blood ran cold. The ice was cracking, long fissures spreading out from the center of the lake. And then, in the distance, the surface of the ice exploded upward, a massive shape breaking through. I only caught a glimpse, something dark and enormous sliding beneath the ice again, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. But it was enough. I floored the gas pedal, the RV lurching forward as I raced away from the lake, the sound of cracking ice echoing behind me. The road was a blur, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I drove, I could still feel it, the weight of something massive beneath the surface, watching, waiting. When I finally reached the main road, the rumbling stopped, but the memory of that thing beneath the ice stayed with me. I'll never forget it. The way the light pulsed, the way the ice cracked as if it were alive. I left the boundary waters behind, but a part of me knows I'll never truly escape it. Some things should stay buried, and whatever's beneath that lake, it's not finished yet. The fog was thicker than I'd expected. I pulled my RV into a secluded clearing in Pisgah National Forest and stepped out into the damp air, the smell of wet earth heavy in my nose. Everything was muffled, as though the forest was holding its breath. The trees were shrouded in mist, their trunks fading into the gloom, and the trail I'd heard so much about was hidden somewhere out there, waiting for me. I'd come here to find something unique. My vlog had been stagnating, and I needed a fresh angle. A fellow hiker had mentioned an unmarked trail, a path that didn't appear on any maps, one that locals swore disappeared and reappeared like it had a life of its own. Perfect. If I could document it, film the mystery, my audience would eat it up. I grabbed my camera and set it up, filming a quick introduction. Hey everyone, it's Nate here, and I'm in the middle of the misty Pisgah National Forest, about to track down the infamous Vanishing Trail. Legend says this path comes and goes, and people who wander too far down it don't come back. I forced a grin. Let's see if that's true. I packed up my gear and set off into the fog. The forest was silent, the only sound my boots crunching on the damp leaves. I had a GPS in my pocket, just in case, but I didn't plan to use it unless things got really bad. I wanted to go off the grid, find this mysterious trail, and see if there was anything to the rumors. I'd always been a skeptic anyway. Ghost stories and folklore, fun to tell around a campfire, but not much else. As I walked, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees. It clung to my skin, cold and heavy, and it wasn't long before I found the first strange marker, a stone slab jutting from the ground, its surface covered in symbols. Strange, spiraling shapes that didn't look like any language I knew. I filmed it, talking into the camera as I described the find. This looks like something from an old burial ground, but there's no mention of this on any maps. Really makes you wonder what else is out here, hidden beneath the fog. I kept moving, the trees closing in tighter. The trail I was following became fainter, more overgrown, and soon it was little more than a game trail, barely wide enough to follow. I pushed forward, keeping my camera rolling. But after another hour of hiking, the trail simply disappeared. I stood there, staring at the ground. One moment, there had been a clear path, and now it was gone, swallowed by the forest. The mist curled around the trees, thick and almost suffocating, but I was certain I'd been on the right trail. I checked my GPS, but the signal flickered weakly. The screen showed that I was in the middle of nowhere, no path, no landmarks, just a blank screen with a blinking dot, me standing alone in the fog. Okay, I muttered, you've dealt with worse. I turned back the way I'd come, but the forest looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth denser. The fog was disorienting, and I had to rely on instinct to retrace my steps. The GPS was useless. I kept walking, scanning the ground for signs of the trail, but there was nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. I froze, listening. The sound came from deeper in the forest, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. I turned, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist. Then, out of the gloom, a figure emerged. An older man, his clothes tattered and damp, his eyes wide and vacant. "Hey!" I called, my voice echoing through the stillness. "You lost too?" The man looked at me for a moment, then shuffled forward. He seemed off. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and there was a distant look in his eyes like he wasn't entirely there. "I've been walking for days," he said, his voice hoarse. "The trail, it keeps changing." "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping toward him. He shook his head. "No one's okay out here." I frowned, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "The trail, it moves. I've seen it, watched it disappear and reappear. It's not just a path, it's the forest. It doesn't want us to leave." I stared at him, my mind racing. This guy was either delirious or onto something. Either way, I didn't like the way he was talking. "Look, I have a GPS," I said, pulling it out. "We can find our way back." The man glanced at the GPS, then back at me. "It won't help. The forest is messing with it." I didn't believe him. Couldn't believe him. I was a rational guy, and this was just a forest. I'd get us back to my RV, get this guy some help, and be done with it. But as we walked, things got stranger. The mist thickened, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. The forest seemed to shift with every step. What had been an open path a moment ago would be choked with brambles when I looked back. Trees seemed to loom closer, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The man, whose name I learned was Eli, grew more agitated with every passing minute. "It's watching us," he muttered. "It knows we're here." "Who's watching?" I asked, growing impatient. "The forest," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's alive, and it's been here long before we were." I ignored him, focusing on the GPS, but even that was failing me. The screen flickered, the signal cutting in and out. At one point, it showed me standing on a clear path, but when I looked up, there was nothing but trees. Thick, twisted trees that looked like they had grown there for centuries. We kept walking, the fog growing thicker, pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but then more distinct. Voices calling out from the mist. "Nate?" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Eli nodded, his eyes wide. "It's calling us. The forest." I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken my name. We came across a backpack tangled in the branches of a tree, high above our heads. It was old, covered in dirt and torn, but when I climbed up to retrieve it, I found fresh supplies inside. Water, food, like someone had packed it yesterday. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had it gotten there? Eli was growing more paranoid, his eyes darting around like he expected the trees to come alive at any moment. "We need to leave," he kept saying, "before it's too late." We pushed forward, but no matter which direction we went, we ended up back where we started. The fog seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the whispers growing louder. Then, without warning, Eli was gone. I turned around, and he was just gone. The forest had swallowed him whole without a sound. I called out his name, but there was no response, only the dense mist pressing in on me. Panic set in. I was alone, lost in a forest that didn't want me to leave. The GPS was useless, and my camera was flickering, showing distorted footage of things I hadn't seen. Shadows moving in the trees, figures lurking just out of sight. I started running, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The trees twisted and shifted around me, the fog so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, the forest closed in, trapping me in a maze of branches and brambles. The whispers were louder now, calling my name over and over. My camera caught glimpses of movement, dark figures moving through the mist, vanishing before I could focus on them. I didn't know what was real anymore. The forest seemed to warp around me, bending reality to its will. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog broke. I stumbled out of the trees and found myself back at my RV. The mist lingered at the edge of the forest, but it didn't follow. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw my gear into the RV, and drove, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in the rearview mirror. Back home, I reviewed the footage. I expected to see the horror I'd witnessed, the proof of the vanishing trail and the strange, shifting forest. But the videos showed nothing. The trail looked normal. The mist wasn't as thick, and Eli wasn't in the footage at all. It was like he'd never existed. I tried to tell myself it had been a bad trip, that my mind had played tricks on me, but deep down, I knew the truth. The forest had let me leave, but it hadn't forgotten me, and I had a feeling it was waiting somewhere in the mist for me to return. The forest around me was too quiet. I'd been sitting by the campfire outside my RV, enjoying the silence for hours. but now something was off. The kind of off you feel in your gut before your brain catches up to what's happening. No wind, no rustling in the leaves, just dead stillness. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled up to this remote campsite deep in Mount Hood National Forest. A place like this should have been full of life, birds, insects, something, but the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the radio I'd brought along. I needed quiet. After everything that had happened over the past year, I wasn't looking for distractions, just isolation. After my wife's death, nothing made sense anymore. People kept telling me I needed to move on, but the noise of life, the sympathy, the well-meaning advice, the friends who didn't know what to say, became unbearable. So I packed up and hit the road, hoping that the wilderness would give me space to think. Or maybe stop thinking altogether. I thought the forest would help. It had, until now. The radio's static broke the silence, a sudden burst of garbled noise that made me jump. I turned my head toward the RV where the old ham radio sat inside. I hadn't even touched the thing in hours. It was an antique, one I'd brought along to mess around with in my downtime, but the signal had been dead all day. No stations, no chatter, nothing, until now. I stood up from the fire, walking over to the RV and ducking inside to check the radio. The static was louder, more insistent, like it was trying to form words but couldn't quite get there. I twisted the dials, searching for a clearer signal, but all I got was more white noise. Then, through the crackling, I heard it. A voice, faint and garbled, speaking numbers. 1, 3, 7, 8, 9. The numbers repeated over and over, mechanical and cold, like a voice from an old number station. It didn't make sense. I was miles from anywhere, and this was supposed to be a dead zone. No signal, no interference. The voice paused for a moment, then the numbers started again. 1, 3, 7. It sent a chill through me, but I told myself it was just some rogue signal bouncing off the atmosphere, maybe a military transmission. There were logical explanations for this kind of thing, I was sure, but the way the numbers repeated over and over felt wrong, like the message wasn't for just anyone, like it was for me. I shut the radio off, my fingers trembling slightly. I wasn't here for this. I needed quiet, not some weird radio signal rattling around in my head. The next day, I tried to forget about the radio. I spent the morning hiking through the woods, the towering pines looming overhead like silent giants. The air was cool and damp, the sky just a sliver of gray through the dense canopy. But something gnawed at me, a faint buzzing at the back of my mind. No birds, no animals, just silence. When I returned to the campsite, the radio was on again, static blaring from the speakers. I hadn't touched it. I stepped inside the RV, staring at the radio like it might come to life. The static was louder now, more intense. I could feel it in my bones like the vibration from a low hum in the ground. And beneath the static, the numbers were back. 1, 3, 7, 8. I slammed my hand down on the off switch, killing the sound. My pulse was racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a glitch, something with the wiring, maybe a stray electrical signal. I'd worked with enough technology over the years to know that things sometimes did strange things when you weren't looking. But the numbers, the way they were so clear, so deliberate. I shook it off and stepped back outside, trying to push the growing unease away. That's when I noticed the man standing at the edge of my campsite. I hadn't heard him approach. He was just there. Tall, scruffy, wearing a weathered jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a camper, but there was something about the way he stood, stiff and tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You lost?" The man looked at me, his face tight with anxiety. I heard it too. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Heard what? The signal. The numbers, he said, glancing toward the RV. I've been picking it up on my own radio. It's not normal. My mouth went dry. You've heard it too? The man nodded. I'm Ben, he said, stepping closer, his voice low. I was camping a few miles down the road. I've been getting static, voices, weird electrical interference. My GPS stopped working. Cell phone drained to 0 in minutes. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. What do you think it is? Ben shook his head, his eyes darting toward the trees. I don't know, but it's not natural. The way the signal moves, it's like it's getting closer. I didn't know how to respond to that. I was a man of logic, of science. Signals were signals, glitches were glitches. But there was something about the way Ben spoke, the fear in his eyes that made my skin crawl. That night, the radio came to life again. I'd tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the campfire and the peaceful silence of the woods, but the static was louder than before, the numbers clearer, more insistent. 1, 3, 7. Ben was sitting across from me, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, his eyes constantly scanning the dark forest around us. He hadn't relaxed since he showed up, and I couldn't blame him. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. You think it's some kind of broadcast? I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. Ben shook his head. I don't think it's a broadcast at all. What do you mean? He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. I think it's a warning, or a signal from something out there. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A warning? From what? Before I could ask, the static on the radio cut out. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. Then, a sound, a soft, rhythmic clicking, like something metallic, tapping against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed darkness. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the forest, and then, through the radio, a voice crackled to life. We see you. My blood ran cold. Ben's eyes widened, his face pale. What the hell was that? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The voice repeated, distorted and mechanical. We see you. I stood up, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The clicking sound was closer now, coming from all around us, moving through the trees. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, the air growing thick and heavy, like the atmosphere itself was alive. I think we should leave, Ben said, his voice tight with fear. For once, I agreed. The next morning, I found Ben's tent abandoned. His gear was scattered around the clearing, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no note, just the cold, empty forest and the low hum of static that had settled into the air like a living thing. I tried to follow his tracks, but they vanished in the thick underbrush. It was like he'd walked into the trees and disappeared. The GPS on my phone was useless, spinning me in circles, the battery draining faster than I'd ever seen. The static in my ears grew louder the further I went, like the signal was inside my head, vibrating through my skull. The numbers were back too, repeating over and over, etched into my mind. 1, 3, 7. By midday, I stumbled across something I hadn't expected. An old, dilapidated radio tower hidden deep in the woods. The metal was rusted, vines crawling up the sides, but it was still faintly humming with power. I climbed the tower, every step echoing in the stillness, my heart hammering in my chest. At the top, I found the source of the signal, a small, glowing device pulsing with an eerie, cold light. It didn't belong here. It wasn't part of the original tower. It was something else, something foreign. I reached out and touched it, and the static in my head exploded. The numbers, the clicking, the voices, it all crashed into me at once, an unbearable cacophony of sound. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the tower as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The lights returned, flickering in the trees, cold and mechanical. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, as if something was chasing me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV. The lights followed me, the clicking never far behind, but I managed to get inside and slam the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the device still clutched in my hand. As I drove away, the static began to fade, but the numbers never left me. They echoed in my mind, a constant whisper, even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror. It's been days now, and I'm still hearing them. 1, 3, 7. I can't get them out of my head, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever sent that signal, knows where I am, and it's not done with me yet.